So 5.6 in this module, or sorry, in this topic 5, we are looking at the relationship between foreign investment flows, trade flows, and how the exchange rate reacts to changes in foreign investment flows and foreign investment flows and net export flows. So an easier way of saying that is we're looking at why NCO equals NX and how the exchange rate moves to make sure that that equation holds over time. But before we continue developing that idea and we move on to the development of the model that we'll be using to help us understand the implications of NCO equaling NX, we need to do a little bit more work on the exchange rate. So what I've got here, and the reason we're doing this will become obvious as we move through the topic. So what I've got here is the demand and supply curve for the Australian dollar. We start off at point A, which is equilibrium, at ER1. Then we're considering up here an increase in mining exports from Australia. So that is inward export revenue. Yes, the iron ore leaves Australia, however, export revenue comes in, and we're interested in the money flows behind all of these economic transactions. So when you say to me increase in mining exports, if my mind is in the context of this part of the course, I'll immediately think export revenue is coming in. And to me, that'll be the only important part of the idea of increased mining exports, the increased export revenue coming into Australia. So foreigners, to buy this iron ore, they have to increase their demand for the Australian dollar to pay for those exports. Now, not many of you, I'm guessing, work in the iron ore industry for BHP or Rio at the moment, but the way the iron ore market works is that iron ore is paid for by the Chinese, by the Japanese, to Australian companies in US dollars, not in Australian dollars. So the increase in the demand for the Australian dollar technically comes from when Rio, BHP, Fortescue take the US dollars that they have been paid for their iron ore and then switch it into Australian dollars. At that point, the demand curve for the Australian dollar shifts to the right. So we start off at A, increased exports of, say, iron ore, shift the demand curve from D to D1. Now, immediately, that creates a bit of a disequilibrium. The disequilibrium doesn't last for very long at all, but, and I'm talking sort of seconds or minutes, if that. So this market re-equilibrates very, very quickly. So we've got demand at point B, but temporarily we've got supply there at point A. So we've got excess demand at the old exchange rate after the demand curve has shifted to the right. Now, what will then happen is that excess demand, just like you learnt in microeconomics, will start causing the exchange rate to appreciate. And as the exchange rate appreciates, you will get an increase in quantity supplied, so a movement along the supply curve from A to C. And then in addition to that, there will be a decrease in quantity demanded, that is a movement along the new demand curve D1 from point B to point C. Now that's all fine if you just want a theoretical understanding of what's going on, but what does that mean in terms of the Australian economy? So if we get this big surge in mining exports, yes, the exchange rate goes up, but what's this business about A to C and B to C? What does that really mean? Well, okay, let's put it in layman's terms, in language that any Australian could understand. So we get this increase in iron ore exports, it shifts the demand curve out to the right. It appreciates the exchange rate. But then you get reactions to that appreciation of the exchange rate. The first reaction is this increase in quantity supplied. But what does that really mean? That is Australians buying more imports of foreign goods. Remember, if you buy an imported good, you are supplying the Australian dollar. So when the exchange rate goes up, we move along the supply curve, indicating that more Australian dollars are being supplied because of the higher exchange rate. And the reason they're being supplied is because you, me, and other Australians are supplying our Australian dollars at a higher exchange rate ER2 to switch our Australian dollars into foreign currency and buy imports. Because with the higher exchange rate ER2, we can take $1,000 Australian and now get far more units of foreign currency than we could when the exchange rate was ER1. So now that the exchange rate has appreciated, we get more more units of foreign currency per 1 unit of Australian dollars. So an appreciation of the exchange rate from ER1 to ER2 means we get more foreign exchange for every $100 Aussie we have. And that obviously means we can buy more imports. Or another way of thinking about it is imports are now cheaper in Australian dollar terms. Those imports are probably the same price in yen if they're coming from Japan, or US dollars if they're coming from America. But in terms of Australian dollars, it takes fewer Australian dollars to buy those imports, even though the foreign price of those goods hasn't changed necessarily. So that's what A to C means. It means that in response to the higher exchange rate, Australians are going out and buying more imported goods. Now, at the higher exchange rate, maybe some Australians are buying more shares as well, maybe more bonds at the higher exchange rate. That's possible. But a large increase in the quantity supplied of the Australian dollar, that is the movement from A to C, will just be more imports. Okay, and then now that we've figured out that A to C means that we are supplying more Australian dollars to take advantage of the high Australian dollar and buy more imports, what does the movement from B to C mean? Well, that's a decrease in the demand for the Australian dollar. That must be foreigners. I'm focusing on the movement from B to C now, because the demand went from A, then it went to B, but as the exchange rate quickly rises, we move back from B to C. So A to B is foreigners demanding more Australian dollars for to pay for these mining exports. But then the exchange rate goes up, then we move from B back to C. So how do you intuitively explain the move from B to back to C? And this happens every time we have a mining boom in Australia, and we have these regularly. It seems like every sort of 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 years, we go through another mining boom where prices are rising. 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 years, we go through a mining boom where mining and energy prices are rising, export volumes are rising, and it shifts the demand curve for the Australian dollar to the right. We went through a big one in the early 2000s. Then from about 2010 through to about 2013, 2014, there was another mining boom. More recently in 2021, we had another big mining boom. So these things are happening quite frequently, and this is helping you understand what actually happens in other parts of the economy. And so the exchange rate goes up because of the mining boom. A to C is an increase in imports. That's you and me buying more foreign products. What is B to C? Well, B to C is foreigners reducing their demand for the Australian dollar because of the exchange rate appreciation. So when you move along the demand curve D1 from B to C, you move along that demand curve because the exchange rate's gone up. That's the only time you move along a demand curve, when the exchange rate appreciates. And so foreigners are reducing their quantity demanded of the Australian dollar, the amount of Aussie dollars they want, because of the higher exchange rate. So why do they want fewer units of Australian dollars when the exchange rate goes up? The reason is because when the exchange rate goes up, for foreigners, tourism to Australia is more expensive. University degrees are more expensive. Everything that we export from Australia becomes more expensive now that the exchange rate has gone up. So what will happen is the mining boom will shift the aggregate demand, it'll shift the demand curve for the Australian dollar to the right. That creates excess demand between A and B. The exchange rate goes up. As the exchange rate goes up, in terms of the demand side of this model, foreigners demand fewer units of the Australian dollar because they're cutting back their purchases of Australian exports because the exchange rate's now higher. So the mining industry benefits. The demand for mining exports has gone up. But as the exchange rate goes up, other industries, other export industries from Australia tend to suffer. And two of the industries that I'm particularly familiar with, the first being education, university education. So every time we have a mining boom, the exchange rate goes up and it is more expensive for foreign students to come to Australia to study. And the second is tourism. Tourism operators will suffer as a result of this mining boom. It's guaranteed. Guaranteed. A mining boom will cause an appreciation of the Australian dollar. That goes without question. And as the Australian dollar goes up, yes, the mining companies benefit from this boom, but as the exchange rate goes up, it makes holidays to Australia more expensive for foreigners. They stay away or find alternative holiday destinations, and the tourism industry suffers. At the same time, I guess the tourism industry suffers, the education industry suffers, all of those other non-mining export industries in Australia generally suffer as a result of this appreciation. But I guess from one perspective, we do all benefit while this boom is in place, because once the boom's over, the demand curve shifts back to D, back to the left, and the exchange rate kind of moves back closer to its original level. So while the exchange rate is elevated during the mining boom, I guess we all benefit because imports are cheaper. So that means we can go on holidays overseas more easily. We can import all sorts of different foreign goods. And as we do that, as we holiday overseas more and we import more foreign goods and services, that is the movement along the supply curve from A to C. So what happens during a mining boom? Mining exports go through the roof, but then the exchange rate appreciates, which encourages all Australians to import more, but then some sectors will suffer a reduction in exports and export values because of the higher exchange rate. Okay, let's do similar sort of analysis, but we'll be able to do it quicker for a bond purchase. So we've got a major new bond issue by the US government. Remember, why does the US government issue bonds? It issues bonds whenever government spending is greater than taxation revenue. And bonds are used to borrow money to cover the difference between the government's high level of spending and its lower level of taxation revenue. Now, when the US government issues new bonds like this, it could be a sort of a 10, 20, $50 billion issue. And investors or lenders from all around the world, including some inside the United States, will be buying these bonds. Let's just imagine that some Australian banks purchase some of these bonds as an investment. So they take the money in your savings account, they package it up with a lot of other money from other people's savings accounts, and they use that money to purchase a bond. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't take your money out. The banks move money around, but your money could be invested while it's in your savings account, could actually be kind of indirectly invested in a US government bond. You don't know where that money's gone, but it will be used for some purpose. It could have been loaned out to a bank and another customer of your bank. It could have been used to purchase some bonds in Australia, some bonds in the US. You just don't know. But let's assume that some Australian bank has purchased some of these bonds. As they do that, that will increase the supply of Australian dollars. So to buy those US government bonds denominated in US dollars, the Australian bank will have to enter the foreign exchange market, which is this market, and increase their supply of the Australian dollar. Now they'll do that so that they can supply those Australian dollars and exchange them for US dollars. And then once they have the US dollars, they then purchase the bonds. So what will then happen when there is increased outward foreign investment from Australia? Outward, the money's flowing out of Australia to pay for the bonds. Foreign investment, well, it's investment because you're purchasing a bond, and that's an investment type asset. And it's foreign because it's a US bond. So outward foreign investment, the purchase by an Australian bank of a foreign bond. It shifts the supply curve to the right. What then happens? Well, at the old exchange rate ER1, temporarily there's excess supply now, because the Australian bank has gone into the foreign exchange market with billions of extra dollars of Australian dollars to swap them for US dollars. So now they're flooding the foreign exchange market with all of these extra dollars. That shifts the supply curve to the right and opens up a gap between A and B, which is a situation of excess supply. Excess supply of anything in any market will drop the price. And the price in this market is the exchange rate. So the exchange rate drops to ER2. Equilibrium is restored by demand increasing, or quantity demand increasing from A to C, and for supply, quantity supply dropping back from B to C. So equilibrium is restored at point C. How do we get there? Well, the supply curve shifts to the right as the banks, Australian banks, take Australian dollars into the Forex market. That opens up a gap between A and B. Equilibrium is restored by combined movement from A to C plus a movement from B to C. So demand we've got excess demand. Demand's there at A, supply's there at B. Supply has got to drop back. Demand has got to increase, and together they kind of move the market back to equilibrium at point C. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. But what's happening in the movement from A to C? So what we're really asking is, when an Australian bank purchases bonds, what are the flow-on effects to other parts of the economy? Well, we know when they purchase bonds, it'll drop the exchange rate and there will be a movement along the demand curve from A to C. This means the exchange rate goes down and foreigners are demanding and buying more Australian dollars. Now, if we take in terms of how many more Australian dollars they purchase, you could measure it off the horizontal axis. So from point A, take a dotted line directly down. From C, take a dotted line directly down. So that horizontal distance there between A and C is the amount of the extra amount of Aussie dollars or Australian dollars that foreigners buy when the exchange rate drops. Why are foreigners buying more Australian dollars in the movement from A to C? Because Australian dollars are cheaper. So everything Australian is cheaper. So those foreigners could be demanding more Australian dollars to buy more Australian exports, things like tourism. So the tourism sector could benefit from this depreciation of the Australian dollar. It could be the education sector that benefits. It could be the wine industry that benefits by increasing wine exports to the rest of the world. It could be the grains industry, wheat, exporting more to foreign countries as the exchange rate drops. But that's what A to C means. It means foreigners are demanding more Australian dollars to buy more Australian stuff. I call it stuff. It could be goods, services, it could be some assets in there as well. If a foreigner is looking at this depreciation thinking the exchange rate's dropping, so it might be a good time to buy some Australian shares because they're expecting the exchange rate to go back up over the course of the next 6-12 months. So it could be an increased demand for the Australian dollars to sort of grab some more Australian shares and wait for the exchange rate to go back up to ER1. That's what A to C means. What does B back to C mean? Well, that means because of the drop in the exchange rate, Australians are supplying fewer Australian dollars. That means another way of saying the same thing is that because of the reduction in the value of the Australian dollar, Australians are demanding fewer units of foreign exchange. Well, why? The answer is because with a lower exchange rate, ER2, foreign currencies are now more expensive to buy. And if foreign currencies are more expensive to buy, everything foreign must be more expensive to buy. Foreign goods, foreign services, foreign assets. So the movement from B back to C is Australians buying fewer foreign goods, services, and assets. And it's likely to be imports by Australians of foreign goods that are most responsive to this exchange rate depreciation down to ER2. So what I'm saying is that movement from B to C as a result of the exchange rate dropping to ER2 is most likely to be a drop in the level of imports into Australia. Okay, so we've got Australian banks purchasing more foreign bonds. In response to that, the exchange rate goes down. Foreigners buy more Australian exports and maybe some additional Australian assets. And then from B to C, that's Australia cutting back the amount of imports from foreign countries that they purchase. And maybe Australians might also cut back their demand for some foreign assets as well when the exchange rate falls. Okay, so you can see from this example and the previous one, whenever we have a mining boom or a big purchase of foreign assets by an Australian bank or some other Australian entity, the exchange rate then reacts and it has flow-on effects to other parts of the economy. And then the final slide in section 5.6 is the balance of payments. So the balance of payments looks like that. It's full of numbers and complex terms and it looks horrible, it looks boring, but in the next video, we're going to run through this and we're not going to treat this table in a boring way. We're going to sort of just highlight the overall structure of the balance of payments. And once we understand the structure of the balance of payments, we'll be able to incorporate this balance of payments concept into this model that we're finally going to develop. So this model is the end point of this topic. And this model reflects this balance of payments. So what we've got to do now in the last part of this video is understand the structure of the balance of payments. Once we understand the structure, in the next video, we can go through the balance of payments in a little bit more detail. But then once we understand that, then we can develop the model. And once we develop this model, I can explain so many different things to you. Okay, so for example, in Germany, they have their version of this model, but the problem is their exchange rate is the euro, and the euro is not at the equilibrium point. It's creating all sorts of problems for Germans and for other countries in the euro area. So that's quite an interesting topic, and we'll be looking at that. But without going through this theory and developing this model, I couldn't possibly explain to you the problems Germany is facing in terms of its trade and its foreign investment, and why other parts of Europe are looking at looking at Germany becoming very wealthy because of the euro currency and resenting Germany as a country. I can explain to you why the motor vehicle industry in the US basically declined. A few years ago, I went through Detroit. I was driving through the center of Detroit. Go back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Detroit was a thriving metropolis because of the car industry. That's where Ford started its very first factory in Detroit, Michigan. It's all gone. Why? Well, this model can help us understand why. There's very good reasons for it. So once we've got this model, we can do some really interesting things with it. But before we do that, we need to understand this, but we're going to deal with this in I think, a more interesting way than maybe you've dealt with it before. We're not going to get stuck on all the numbers and all the different bits and pieces here. We're going to look at it at a very high level, but before we do that, we need to understand the overall structure of the balance of payments. So the balance of payments records all of the monetary flows associated with all of the international transactions that we've been talking about. So we've been talking about, back here, we've been talking about goods and services flowing in and out of Australia. We've been talking about foreign investment flows in and out of Australia. All of those foreign transactions that we've been talking about are recorded in here. Now, of course, these are totals and subtotals, so you don't see individual transactions, but they're all in there. So Fortescue exporting iron ore, it's in here. You buying some Google shares, it's in here. You going on a foreign holiday, that's an import, it's in here. The value of the money, it's in here, in these tables. So that's why we need to understand the balance of payments, because it records in terms of the monetary flows, all of the trade flows, the investment flows that we've been talking about between countries, they're all recorded here. Or the monetary values associated with those flows are recorded here. Dividend payments, interest payments from one country to another, they're all here. So the overall structure of the balance of payments, first of all, there's a current account, and then there is a capital financial account. Now, the current account is up here. It starts there and goes down to here. The current account, we're going to refer to that as NX. Now, that's not 100% correct. Some of you that have done this before might see the sort of the flaws in this logic, the holes in my argument. That's fine, but we're simplifying for now. We can make it more complex later. We can make it as complex as you want. But what I'm going to say is this variable that we've been talking about, NX, I'm going to refer to that. That's exports minus imports. I'm going to refer to that as the current account balance. Is that correct technically? No. I'm having to stretch definitions here a long way. Does that matter that I'm doing that for now? No, of course it doesn't. If it mattered, I wouldn't do it. So I'm going to say very loosely that this value here is the value of net exports in Australia, 2007-2008, minus 74 billion. And in the next year, net exports were 38,780 million, etc. Okay. The next part of the balance of payments is the capital plus financial account. So that's the capital account just there. Now you'll notice that the capital account isn't really overly important. The balance is tiny and the numbers are very small, and there's even some missing numbers, almost no transactions. The financial account, however, that's where all of the action is. A lot of big numbers, positive 72 billion, positive 40 billion, positive 54 billion. Okay, but we're going to treat the capital financial account together. This is just the way these accounts are set up. So we've got two separate sub accounts. The first one is the current account from there to there. The second is the capital financial account. Just keeping in mind, the capital account's not overly important. The financial account is where everything happens in terms of where all of the big transactions are recorded. Now, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Remember what these numbers represent. They represent the monetary flows underlying all transactions involving an Australian or an Australian organisation and a foreigner and or a foreign organisation. These are international transactions involving Australia and a foreigner. Current account, capital account. Now, while the current account, I'm going to refer to that balance there, these balances there, as net exports. With the capital financial account, I'm going to refer to those balances as net capital outflow, which is represented as S minus I. Okay, so what you can see is in this model we're going to develop in the next couple of videos, we've got a line representing S minus I, and we've got a line representing NX, and we can move these lines around and see what happens. So S minus I has got its own line, NX has got its own line. Coming back to here, I'm calling S minus I the capital financial account. It's this number here. And NX, this curve, well, I'm calling that the current account balance. In this model, what we'll see when we get to it is that at that point, at point A, S minus I equals NX. In fact, they're both equal to, say, 60 billion. S minus I equals NX. Now, if we come back to here, S minus I equals NX. Is that true? Well, and this is what I'll have to explain a little bit later. Yeah, this is a little bit complicated to explain at this point. But anyway, when I say that S minus I equals NX, in terms of the model, they do have the same value, that is 60 billion. But when I say S minus I equals NX at point A, and I move to this balance of payments table, then it's the absolute value of these variables that equal. Okay, so the absolute value of S minus I is 72 billion. The absolute value of net exports is 74 billion. Positive, because I'm taking the absolute value. So does S minus I equal NX like it would in this model? S minus I at A, S minus I is 60 billion and NX is 60 billion as well. So is that true in this model? Well, 72 billion, 74, pretty close. 39, say 40 billion, 39 billion, pretty close. 54 billion, 54 billion. Now we move to some quarterly versions of these tables. These are years, now quarterly versions. 12 billion, 12.5 billion, 15.6 billion, 15.7 billion, 19.7 billion, 19.7. 15.3, 15.4. It's pretty close. And the differences are just captured by this error term down the bottom that we call net errors and omissions. So looking at these numbers, which is an actual data for Australia, yeah, the data is about 10 years old, that doesn't matter. Looking at actual data, we can see that S minus I, 54 billion, does actually equal net exports 54 billion. So S minus I, apparently, according to this data, S minus I does actually equal NX. There's small errors, but they're tiny. Now, who cares about those errors? S minus I apparently does equal NX. Once again, this is going to take a little bit of time to wrap your head around. S minus I is NCO. NX is just, yeah, NX is NX. So this equation is saying NX equals S minus I. So that holds when we're at that point in that model that we're going to learn about soon. So this is the first, this is where this part of the course is getting a little bit complex. So you may need to sort of redo the reading of the textbook, the required readings, and go through this a couple of times as sort of horrible a thought that might be, before it really sinks in. But this is a really important part of the course. There's going to be 1 or 2 questions about this type of about these concepts in the final exam, absolutely guaranteed. So you absolutely need to wrap your head around this this concept. Topic 5 is one of the more important topics that we've been through so far in the course. Right throughout the course, it's one of the most important topics, because it really does show you the interaction between Australia and the rest of the world in terms of investment flows and trade flows, and how it all works. And then we can really develop some interesting case studies, and we'll do that in topic 6 primarily. So what I'll be doing in the next video is going through the structure of this. Now, you would have read about the structure in the one of the required readings for this topic, but I think just me taking you through it and emphasizing what's important and what's not is really going to help, and it's really going to be complementary to what you've read about the balance of payments in the required reading that you've done. So yeah, we'll leave it there. So in this topic, yeah, we sort of finished off with the balance of payments, and we're ready to sort of launch ourselves into a full-on assault of the balance of payments and really figure it out, and then develop that model and then start applying it. So balance of payments, 2 main sub-accounts: the current account, the balance account, the current account and the capital financial account. One, in terms of absolute values, they equal each other. And of course, I'll tell you very soon why we need to take absolute values to make this equation hold. It'll all make sense very, very soon. So yeah, so that's the end of this recording, and the next one I will start on this, which is topic 5.7. Even though I haven't numbered it, this is 5.7.